She was 22 years old when she signed her name to a bookshop no one in Edinburgh had wanted. Old Carstairs had died 3 months earlier, and by the time the ink dried, she had precisely £4.11 left. The solicitor who handled the sale had not smiled when he passed her the deed. He had looked at her over the rim of his spectacles, the way one looks at a small animal that has wandered indoors. He spoke in the careful tone of a man who did not wish to be blamed later. The property came without warranties of any kind. Clara Reed Harcourt folded the paper twice and placed it in her inner coat pocket, beside the small leather ledger she carried everywhere. She thanked him and asked for nothing else. Outside the solicitor's office on George Street, the sky was the colour of pewter. A thin sleet had begun to fall, and the wind that came up from the Firth of Forth pushed at the hem of her coat with a small, persistent hand. She walked south towards the old town, because that was where the bookshop was, and because she had nowhere else in particular to walk. Her trunk, which contained everything she now owned in the world, had been sent ahead by a carter she had hired for 1 shilling and 6pence, a man named MacLeod, with a red beard and eyes that were kinder than his trade required. Her father had been Edmund Harcourt. In the offices along Charlotte Square his name had once carried the weight of 30 years of careful judgment. He had been a broker, not a speculator. The distinction had mattered to him. A broker held other people's money the way a nurse held other people's children, with hands that did not forget, at any moment, that the thing belonged to someone else. He had told her that when she was 15 and had asked him what he did all day, he had been dead 6 months. They had found him at his desk with his head bent over an unopened letter, as though he had been about to read it and had been interrupted by something he could not refuse. The doctor had said it was his heart. The newspapers had said it was his shame. Between the two, Edinburgh had chosen the more interesting explanation, and by the time Clara had buried him, there was no version of her father left in the city that she recognized. The bank that had ruined him was Finch and Sons. It had been founded by old Josiah Finch, and it was now run by Josiah's son, Alistair, a man of 41 with pale hair combed back from a high forehead and a mouth that seemed to have decided, early in life, against warmth. It was Alistair Finch who had come to Charlotte Square in the days after her father's collapse, carrying documents in a leather case. And it was Alistair Finch who had explained to Clara, over tea she had not offered him, that her father's affairs were in regrettable disorder, that liabilities exceeded assets by a considerable sum, and that the house on Heriot Row would have to be sold. She had asked to see the documents. He had smiled, a small, dry smile, and said the matter was too intricate for a young woman to profit by examining. He had used the word profit as though it amused him. She had held his gaze for a long moment, and then asked him to leave. Within 8 weeks she had lost the house, the furniture, her father's library, and the small annuity that had been settled on her at her christening. Her father's brother, Colonel Harcourt, had written from Perth to say that while he was of course sorry for her situation, the family name had suffered an injury from which it could not soon recover, and it would be better for all concerned if she did not present herself at any Harcourt household until such time as memories had faded. He had signed the letter with his full initials, as though he were closing an account. She had read the letter twice and burned it in the grate, and she had not written back. What remained to her was £18. It was the sum she had gathered by selling, one at a time, the small personal things the bailiffs had overlooked: a coral bracelet, a silver thimble, a set of ivory hair combs. 3 books her father had given her that were not part of his catalogued library, and a small watercolour of a heron that had hung in her bedroom since she was 7. She had counted the money on a Tuesday evening in the boarding-house on Cowgate, and she had understood, without any particular grief, that £18 was not a life. It was a doorway, and one had to walk through doorways or stand in them. One could not live in them. She had walked into the estate agent's office the next morning and asked what could be bought outright, freehold, for £18 in the city of Edinburgh. The clerk had laughed, then seen her face and stopped laughing, and gone into a back room and returned with a single deed in a brown paper envelope. There was Carstairs' old shop, he said, off the Royal Mile, which the Trust had been trying to unload since old Carstairs died 3 months earlier, £15 and taxes owing on top. It was not, he had felt obliged to add, a property that anyone had visited with pleasure in his lifetime. She had said yes before she had seen it. That was what she was thinking of now, as she walked south with the sleet coming harder, and she was not thinking of it with regret exactly, but with the sober attention one gives to the shape of a decision one has already made. The close was called Flesher's Close, which she thought a poor name for a street of books, and it opened off the Royal Mile between a chandler's shop and a public house, whose sign showed a black horse with one white foot. She turned in under the archway, and the wind fell away behind her at once, replaced by the older, closer air of the old town, which smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. The close was narrow enough that she could have touched both walls with outstretched hands. Halfway along, on the left, a small wooden sign hung by one hook from an iron bracket, and though the paint was peeled almost to bare wood, she could still read, in a careful old hand, the words Carstairs Books, bought and sold. The window beside the door was so thick with grime that she could not at first see through it. She took her handkerchief from her sleeve and rubbed a small clear circle in the glass, and she looked in. She saw, in the dim light that reached through the close, a shop that had died and had been left as it was on the day of its death. The counter was a long, dark shape furred with dust. Behind it and along both side walls, and in a great island in the middle of the floor, the bookshelves stood packed to their tops, and more books were stacked on the shelf ends, and more books were heaped in leaning towers on the floor, so that the whole shop had the look of a slow, dry landslide arrested in the act. A wooden ladder was fixed to a rail along one wall, a brass lamp hung from the ceiling by a chain. There were cobwebs in the corners as thick as knitting, and at the far end, where a small window looked out into an inner court, the panes were broken and had been stuffed with rags. She stood at the window for perhaps 2 minutes. She had felt then, for the first time since her father's funeral, a small definite emotion that was not grief and not fear. It was closer to recognition. It was not welcome exactly. It was simply that the place, ruined as it was, seemed to have been waiting. She took the key from her pocket. It was iron and heavy enough to be a small weapon, and it turned in the lock with the slow complaining sound of a thing that had made up its mind long ago to stay shut. The door opened inward, scraping across the flagged floor and pushing a small crescent of dust before it. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, and she stood for a moment in the cold silence of a room that had not been walked in for 3 months. The smell was the first thing. It was the smell of old paper, which she had known all her life in her father's library. But here it was thickened by damp and by the ghost of pipe tobacco and by something else. A faint sweetness she could not name, which she thought later might have been the beeswax old Carstairs had used on the shelves. Beneath these smells was the deep cold mineral smell of a building sunk 2 feet into the hill. She did not weep. She had not wept since the morning of the funeral, and she had made herself a small private promise on that morning that she would not weep again until she was certain the weeping was for something and not merely against it. She stood in the dust with her hands folded in front of her, and she made an inventory in her head of what needed to be done first. This was the habit Mrs. Gable had taught her. Begin with what can be done tonight. Mrs. Gable had been the housekeeper at Heriot Row for 31 years. She had come to the Harcourts as a young widow with a face already set into its patience, and she had run the house with a hand so quiet that Clara, growing up, had not understood until she was almost 16 that a house did not run itself. It was Mrs. Gable who had first put a household ledger into Clara's hands on the morning of Clara's 12th birthday and had said, in the voice she used for things that mattered, that a woman who could not read a page of figures could be robbed by any man who could. She had taught Clara to enter every farthing on the day it was spent, and to reconcile the column at the end of every week, and to look, when the columns did not agree, not for the missing shilling, but for the habit of mind that had let it go missing. She had taught her to write in a small clear hand, without flourishes, because flourishes, she said, were where thieves hid. Mrs. Gable had died a year before Edmund Harcourt. In her own bed in the small room at the top of the house that she had refused, all her life, to leave for a larger one. She had left Clara two things: a small leather-bound ledger of the household accounts from 1889, and a black fountain pen with a nib that had been reground 3 times. Clara carried them both in the inner pocket of her coat. She had carried them through the bailiff's and the boarding-house and the solicitor's office, and she carried them now into the shop that was, for the first time in her life, her own. She began that afternoon with the front window. She had no cloths, so she tore a strip from the lining of her second petticoat and wetted it at the small brass pump in the back court, which, to her surprise, still ran, though the water came up brown for a long minute before it came clear. She worked from the top of the window down, and she did not stop until she had cleared enough glass for the light of the close to come in properly. The light showed her in the far corner behind the counter a small cast-iron stove with a scuttle of coal beside it, and a kettle on a hob, and a tin box that proved, when she opened it, to contain 3 candle ends and a paper of matches still dry in their wax. She lit the stove. The chimney drew after a long, doubtful minute, and by the time MacLeod arrived with her trunk, there was heat enough in the front room to melt the sleet from her hair. MacLeod set the trunk down inside the door and looked about him with the flat expression of a man who has seen worse and does not intend to say so. He asked her whether she had anyone coming to help her, and she said she had not. He nodded once and went out, and came back a quarter of an hour later with a broom, a scrubbing brush, a bar of yellow soap, and a half loaf of bread wrapped in newspaper. He set them on the counter and said the broom and brush she could return when she was done with them, and the soap and bread she could keep. He would not take payment. He touched the brim of his cap and was gone before she could find the words she needed. That night she slept on the floor behind the counter, wrapped in her coat and in a horse blanket MacLeod had left, without saying so, folded at the bottom of her trunk. The building spoke to itself in the small hours, in the voice buildings have, and twice she woke to the sound of something small moving among the books. In the morning she found, sitting on the counter with its tail curled around its paws, a thin ginger cat with one torn ear, regarding her with the steady, patient look of a landlord considering a tenant. She poured a little of her tea into a saucer and set it on the floor. The cat drank without hurry, and when it had finished it climbed into her lap and slept there for an hour. She called it ink, because its ears were the colour of the ink Mrs. Gable had used in the ledger, and because a bookshop, she thought, needed an ink. The work of the shop began that morning, and it did not stop for many weeks. She began with the floor. She swept it in stages, moving books from one pile to another in order to clear each square of flagstones, and she scrubbed each square with the yellow soap and the brush from MacLeod, and she let each square dry before she moved to the next. The floor, when it emerged, was a fine dark slate, and there were places where the flags had been worn into shallow bowls by the passage of feet over 2 centuries. And she stood at the doorway when the last square was done, and she looked along the length of the room, and she felt, for the first time, that something had been given back to itself. She did the walls next, and the ceiling with a long broom she wrapped in a rag, and the counter, which took her a whole day, because it was carved along its front edge with a pattern of oak leaves that had held 3 months of dust in every vein. She washed the brass lamp and refilled it with paraffin she bought for a shilling from the chandler's shop next door. She swept the ashes from the stove and blacked it with the small tin of stove polish she found in the tin box beneath the counter, along with a stub of pencil, a bone-handled paper knife and a folded advertisement dated 1904 for a lecture on the poetry of Robert Burns. Then she began on the books. There were, by her first count, something over 11,000 volumes in the shop. She counted them by shelves, and she wrote the count in the back of Mrs. Gable's ledger, and she gave herself no deadline for the sorting, because she knew that a deadline was a kind of lie one told oneself, and she had promised in the boarding house on Cowgate that she would tell herself no more lies. She began at the shelf nearest the door, on the right-hand side, and she took down each book in turn, and she examined it, and she cleaned it, and she made a decision about it. The decisions were four. A book that was sound and readable and of a subject that people bought went onto a middle shelf, sorted by subject and by author, with the price penciled on the flyleaf in her small, clear hand. A book that was sound but of a subject too narrow to sell in Edinburgh went into a bin at the back, to be offered later in bundles to the country dealers who came down for the summer sales. A book that was damaged past repair but had good plates or maps was set aside for the print cutters, who would pay a few pence for each. A book that was beyond any use at all, swollen with damp, gnawed by mice, missing more pages than it had, she carried out to the back court and burned in the small brazier she had made from an old paint tin. She kept a separate list in the ledger of the books she burned. She did not know why. It seemed to her that a book, even a ruined one, ought not to go out of the world unrecorded. She worked from 8 in the morning until the light failed, and then she lit the brass lamp and worked by it until her eyes could no longer distinguish one small type from another. And then she ate a piece of bread with cheese if she had cheese, and with dripping if she had not. And she drank a cup of tea, and she slept behind the counter with ink at her feet. On the 7th day she opened the shop door for the first time to the public, though there was as yet no sign in the window and no notice in the paper, and she sold a shilling's worth of books to a young man in a green scarf who had wandered in out of curiosity and had stayed an hour. She entered the shilling in the ledger. It was the first entry in a new column she had ruled that morning, and she looked at it for a long time before she went on with her work. Word travels in the old town by ways that no one entirely understands. By the end of the second week, people were coming into the close to look at the shop that had opened. Some of them bought books, most of them did not. They stood in the doorway and looked at the young woman in the plain black dress who moved among the shelves with a duster and a pencil, and they went away and told other people, and the other people came. She was polite to all of them. She answered questions about books when she could, and admitted ignorance when she could not, and she wrote down, in a separate small notebook, the titles that people asked for and did not find, so that she might watch for them at the sales. It was in the third week that she came to the law books. They were on the 2 lowest shelves of the tall case behind the counter, where old Carstairs had evidently thought them safe from casual browsers. There were about 400 of them, volumes of statutes, reports of cases, treatises on conveyancing and on the law of Scotland, bound in the heavy dark calf of the last century, with red and black labels on their spines. She had approached them with the small unease of a person handling instruments she did not fully understand, but she had set herself the same rule for them as for the rest. Down from the shelf, dusted, examined, decided. The first of the heavy ones she noticed was a volume of Erskine's Institutes, the 2nd edition, in fair condition but unusually heavy for its size. She had thought, when she lifted it, that the binding was perhaps of a denser leather than she was used to. She set it on the counter and opened it, and she turned through the first pages, and she came about a third of the way in to a place where 2 pages would not part. She tried to slip her paper knife between them and could not. The 2 pages had been glued along their outer edges all the way round, and where they met at the foredge, the seam had been trimmed so cleanly that a casual reader turning the book would have passed the place without noticing that anything was different from any other opening. She held the book up to the lamp. She could see faintly the shadow of something between the two pages, a thin rectangle, a little smaller than the page, with a straight edge. She did not open it. She set the volume aside on the counter, and she went on with the shelf, and she found, before the afternoon was done, 4 more books of the same sort, a volume of Bell's commentaries, 2 volumes of session cases, and a treatise on the law of bills and notes, each with the same weight, each with the same small hidden thickness between 2 glued pages. She set them all together on the counter, and she covered them with a clean linen cloth, and she went on with her work as though she had not seen them, because she had learned, from her father, that a thing which one does not understand should not be spoken of until one does. That evening she wrote in the ledger, in the private column at the back, that Mrs. Gable had taught her to keep for notes to oneself the words, 5 volumes, law, sealed pages, investigate. The old printer came the following week. His name was Mr. Abernathy, and he was, she guessed, 75 or so. He was very thin and very upright, and he wore a coat that had been good once and was still, in its exhausted way, respectable. He came into the shop on a Tuesday afternoon, and he stood for some minutes in the doorway, looking about him without speaking, and then he came forward to the counter and he lifted his hat, and he said, in a voice that was courteous and slow, and carried a soft western burr, that he had known old Mr. Carstairs. She gave him a chair and made him a cup of tea. He drank it without hurry. He asked her name and she gave it, and he did not react to it, which was a courtesy of another kind, because in Edinburgh in that year the name of Harcourt was not one that passed without reaction. He looked about him at the shelves and at the swept floor, and at Ink, who had climbed onto the counter and settled beside the ledger, and he nodded once, slowly. "You have made a beginning," he said. She said she had. He asked her whether she had come yet to the books of law. She said she had. He looked at her for a long moment then, over his teacup, and she had the sense that he was weighing something, not in her, but in himself. Then he set the cup down. "Old Carstairs," he said, "cared for what was bound and not for what was read." He said it quietly, as though it were a small pleasantry, and he did not look at the shelf behind her when he said it. He asked her then about the roof and about the stove, and about whether she had trouble with damp in the back room. And he told her that if ever she needed a paper of matches or a length of string, she was to send for him at the printing house in Bakehouse Close, 3 doors down from the Wind, and that he would come. He drank the rest of his tea, and he thanked her for it, and he stood up and lifted his hat, and he went out, and she stood behind the counter for a long time after he had gone, looking at the linen cloth on the shelf. Old Carstairs cared for what was bound, and not for what was read. She thought about that sentence for 3 days. She thought about it while she swept, and while she scrubbed, and while she carried coal up from the cellar, and she thought about it at night with Inky against her side, and on the 4th day she took down the 5 books from behind the linen cloth, and she carried them into the back room, and she closed the door. She had bought that morning from Mr. Abernathy in Bakehouse Close a small bone folder and a very sharp thin-bladed knife of the sort binders used for paring leather. He had sold them to her without comment. She had paid him 9p. She worked on the first book, the Erskine, for the whole of that afternoon. She did not cut the pages open. Instead, she slit, very carefully, along the seam at the foredge, following the line of the old trimming. The glue at the top and bottom she softened with a wet cloth pressed for many minutes, and then she eased the 2 pages apart with the bone folder as one eases apart the 2 halves of a shell. Between the pages lay a folded sheet of banking paper. She lifted it out with the tips of her fingers. It was a certified copy of a bond dated 1907, drawn between the firm of Finch & Sons and a gentleman named James Elphinstone of Leith. She did not recognize the name. She read the bond twice slowly, and she understood, on the second reading, that it referred to a loan of a size that had been secured against a property, and that the terms of the loan were of a kind she had never seen in her father's papers, because her father had held such terms in contempt. She folded the paper back along its creases, and she set it aside. She turned to the next book. By the end of that night she had opened all 5 volumes, and she had before her, on the backroom table, 22 documents. 8 were copies of bonds like the first, each drawn between Finch and Sons and a different Edinburgh gentleman, all dated between 1903 and 1909, all bearing the same peculiar clause which she read again and again until she understood it, which was that in the event of a certain kind of default, a default that could be triggered by the lender himself, by the calling in of another instrument, the whole of the borrower's business assets fell to the lender at a valuation set by the lender's own agent. 4 were letters. They were written on the letterhead of Finch and Sons in the small square hand of old Josiah Finch, and they were addressed, all 4 of them, to a man named Robert Kerr, who had been, she remembered now with a small cold turn of the stomach, the senior clerk in her father's office for 11 years. The letters spoke, in the careful oblique way of men who know their words may be read one day by a jury, of the desirability of certain instruments being presented for settlement on certain dates, and of the gratitude which Finch and Sons would feel, at year's end, for the particular kindness of Mr. Kerr in the matter of timing. 6 were pages torn, or rather cut, from what appeared to be the private day-book of a broker's clerk. The dates ran from March to August of the year her father had died. The entries were in a hand she did not know, but she knew, before she had read 3 of them, whose office was being described. They described a series of transactions in which securities held by her father's firm on behalf of clients had been presented for redemption, unnecessarily and out of sequence, in a manner calculated to force her father into the open market at a moment when the open market had been quietly seeded by Finch and Sons with an oversupply of the same securities. The entries did not use the word conspiracy. They did not need to. Any broker in Edinburgh, reading them, would have known. And 4, finally, were bearer bonds. She knew what bearer bonds were. Her father had explained them to her once, without approval, as instruments payable to whoever presented them, without proof of ownership, and therefore useful chiefly to the sort of people who preferred that ownership not be proved. These were drawn on the Bank of Scotland and on the Union Bank, and their face values, when she added them, came to something over £4,000. She sat for a long time at the back-room table, with the 22 documents in front of her and ink at her elbow, and she did not move. The candle burned down, and she lit another from its stub. She understood, without needing to construct the argument, what she was looking at. Old Carstairs had been someone's friend, or old Carstairs had been someone's confessor. Either way, into his hands, over some years, had come the papers by which certain quiet ruinations in Edinburgh could be unruined, and he had done with those papers the only thing that occurred to a bookseller of his generation. He had bound them into books. He had put them where no bailiff would look and no heir would sell, and he had gone on selling volumes of poetry across the counter, and he had died with his secret in his shelves, and for 3 months no one had opened the shelves, because no one had wanted the shop. She understood also that among the men who had been quietly ruined was her father, and that among the papers on the table were the papers by which his name could be lifted out of the mud of the newspapers and set back on the shelf where it belonged. She did not weep. She had thought, when she began to understand, that she might. But the emotion that came to her in the small back room with the smell of old paper and the ginger cat pressed warm against her wrist was not grief and not triumph. It was closer to the feeling one has when, in a long edition, the final column comes out even. It was the feeling Mrs. Gable had taught her to trust. She folded the documents, one by one, and she wrapped them in a clean square of linen, and she carried them upstairs to the small room above the shop where she now slept, and she laid them in the bottom of her trunk beneath the horse blanket, and she locked the trunk, and she went down again and put the kettle on the stove. She did nothing with the documents for 11 days. It was not indecision. It was the habit Mrs. Gable had taught her of never posting a letter written in heat. She went on with the shop. She sorted books. She sold books. She entered the shillings and the pence in the ledger. She fed ink, and she paid MacLeod when he came by for the sack of coal he had left at her door without asking, and she took her tea on the Tuesday of that week with Mr. Abernathy in the small room behind his press, and she did not speak to him of what she had found, though she thought from the way he watched her over the rim of his cup that he knew she had found it. And on the 12th day Alistair Finch came to the shop. She had known in some part of her mind that he would come. Word had travelled, as word travelled in the old town, that Edmund Harcourt's daughter had opened a bookshop off the Royal Mile, and it was in the nature of Alistair Finch to come and see. He arrived on a wet afternoon in the last week of November, in a black coat with an astrakhan collar, and he stood in the doorway shaking the rain from his hat and looking about him with the small precise smile of a man calculating a valuation. He did not at first appear to recognize her. He came to the counter and asked, in the voice one uses to shop girls, whether she had a copy of Lockhart's Life of Scott. She said she had, and she took it down from its shelf, and she set it on the counter. He looked at it without picking it up. Then he looked at her. "Miss Harcourt," he said. "Mr. Finch." He smiled the small dry smile she remembered from the drawing-room at Heriot Row. He looked slowly along the shelves and up at the brass lamp and down at Ink, who had opened one eye and closed it again, and he said, in the tone of a man making conversation with a child who has built a house of cards, that he was glad to see her turning her hand to something honest. He said he had wondered, when he heard she had taken this shop, whether she quite understood the difficulty of trade. He said trade required judgment, and judgment, he was afraid, was not a thing that ran always in families. He said her father had been in the end a lesson to them all in the perils of poor judgment, and he hoped, for her sake, that she had learned from it. She stood behind the counter with her hands folded on the ledger, and she looked at him, and she said nothing. He waited, perhaps, for her to answer. When she did not, he laid a half-crown on the counter beside the book, and he took the book up, and he said he would call again in the spring to see how she was getting on. He touched the brim of his hat, and he went out. She did not move for perhaps a minute. Then she lifted the half-crown and looked at it, and she entered the sale in the ledger in her small clear hand. 1 vol, Lockhart, Life of Scott, 2s 6d. She underlined the entry once. Then she took down, from the shelf behind her, the volume of Erskine's Institutes, and she carried it to the back room, and she took from its hollow the 8 bonds and the 4 letters, and the 6 pages of the clerk's day book, and the 4 bearer bonds, and she laid them out on the table, and she sat down before them, and she began to make a list. The list took her 3 weeks to finish. She worked at it in the evenings, after the shop was closed, and Ink was asleep on the counter, and the coals in the stove had burned down to the small red heart at their centre. She made a fair copy of each document in her own hand, on paper she bought from Mr. Abernathy at cost. She made a schedule of the bonds, showing the borrower, the date, the sum, and the peculiar clause. She made a schedule of the letters, showing sender, recipient, date, and substance. She made a schedule of the daybook entries, showing date, security, transaction, and the account into which the proceeds had eventually flowed, which was in every case an account held in the name of a nominee of Finch and Sons. She made a schedule of the bearer bonds, with their numbers and their issuers and their face values. She wrote a covering statement, 6 pages long, in which she set out, in the plain small sentences Mrs. Gable had taught her, what the documents showed, and what they did not show, and what a competent solicitor would need to do to bring the matter to court. She did not sign the statement. She did not need to. Anyone who read the ledger could see whose hand had written it. On the last day of December, in a fine dry cold that had frozen the puddles in the close into small dark mirrors, she put on her coat and she walked down the Royal Mile to the office of Mr. Sutherland, W.S., in Advocates' Close. She had chosen Mr. Sutherland for two reasons. The first was that her father, in the last conversation she remembered having with him about business, had named Sutherland as one of 3 solicitors in Edinburgh whom he would trust with a sealed envelope. The second was that Sutherland had not attended her father's funeral and had written to her afterwards briefly to say that he had not attended because he had not believed the newspapers, and he had not believed the newspapers because he had known her father for 30 years, and he had thought it would be an impertinence to stand at the graveside of a man he was not yet ready to give up. She had kept the letter. She carried it with her now in the inner pocket of her coat next to the ledger. Mr. Sutherland was a small round man of 60, with white hair combed carefully across a pink scalp and eyes of a startling pale blue. He received her in a room lined with green books and smelling of pipe tobacco, and he shook her hand with a formality that did not, she thought, disguise a certain gentleness underneath. She sat down opposite him, and she opened the linen-wrapped bundle on his desk, and she set beside it her schedules and her covering statement, and she said only that she believed the documents to be genuine, that she had found them in the course of sorting a shop she had purchased, and that she wished to know what could properly be done with them. He read for a long time. He did not speak while he read. He read the covering statement first, and then the schedules, and then he began on the documents themselves, and by the time he came to the 4th of the letters he had taken off his spectacles and was polishing them slowly with a large white handkerchief, and she saw that his hands were not entirely steady. When he had finished, he sat for some minutes without speaking. Then he laid his spectacles on the desk, and he looked at her. "Miss Harcourt," he said, "do you understand what you have brought me?" "I believe I do." "You have brought me," he said, "the proof that your father was an honest man." She did not answer at once. She looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap over the ledger, and she said, when she was able, that she had believed that already, and what she had needed was the proof that other people might. He nodded once, slowly. He said that the matter would not be simple. He said that Finch and Sons was a house of standing in the city, and that Alistair Finch would fight, and that the courts moved slowly, and that there would be, before the end of it, unpleasantness of a kind she should prepare herself for. He said, however, that the documents were what they were, and that the law of Scotland, whatever its faults, did not in the end tolerate what these documents showed, and that if she would leave the matter with him, he would see it through. She said she would leave the matter with him. She asked him, before she went, about the bearer bonds. She said she did not wish to keep them. She said she believed they had belonged, in one sense or another, to the men whose names appeared on the schedules, or to their families, and she wished them to go, as far as could be arranged, back to those hands. He looked at her for a long moment then, with the pale blue eyes very steady, and he said that this was perhaps the most unusual instruction he had received in 40 years of practice, and that he would carry it out to the letter. She walked home up the Royal Mile in the last light of the year. The sky over the castle was the colour of a pale rose. The wind had gone. In the close, the lamp above her door was already lit, because she had lit it that morning before she went out, and Ink was waiting on the inside of the window, sitting very upright with his tail curled around his paws, watching the passage. The matter took, in the end, 14 months. She did not attend the hearings. Mr. Sutherland had advised her not to, and she had accepted his advice, because she had understood that her presence would turn the matter, in the newspapers, into something other than what it was. She stayed in the shop, she sorted books, she sold books, she learned from the summer dealers who came down from Perth and Aberdeen how to price a first edition and how to spot a made-up copy, and she learned from Mr. Abernathy how to rebind a spine and how to repair a torn plate with wheat paste and Japanese tissue. She took on, in the spring, a boy of 14 named Thomas, whose mother kept the public house at the corner of the close, and she paid him 3 shillings a week to run errands and to carry parcels, and she taught him in the evenings to read a page of figures. She read the newspapers only on Sundays, and she read them without hurry. She read that a formal complaint had been laid against Finch and Sons by a solicitor acting for a number of parties. She read some months later that the firm was under investigation by a committee of the Faculty of Advocates. She read, in the following autumn, that Alistair Finch had resigned as managing partner and had left the city for the south. She read, in the same week, that a public statement had been issued by the Society of Writers to the Signet, in which the name of the late Edmund Harcourt was referred to in terms that would have satisfied, she thought, even Mrs. Gable, who had been hard to satisfy. She read these things in the small room above the shop, with ink asleep on her feet and the ledger open on her knee. She did not cut the notices out. She did not paste them into a book. She read them once, and she folded the papers, and she used them in the ordinary way to lay the fire. The families of the 8 gentlemen named in the bonds were, in the course of the following year, quietly approached by Mr. Sutherland and quietly reimbursed, so far as reimbursement was possible, from the funds that the investigation had recovered from Finch and Sons and from the bearer bonds that Clara had returned. 2 of the families wrote to her afterwards. She answered both letters, briefly and without ornament, and she did not keep copies of her replies. Colonel Harcourt wrote to her, in the spring of that second year, from Perth. His letter was long, and he had taken considerable pains with it. He wished, he said, to express his regret for the tone of his earlier correspondence, and to invite her, at her convenience, to visit the family at Perth. He said the name of Harcourt had been restored to its proper standing, and it was right that its remaining members should be seen together. She read the letter twice, as she had read the first. She did not burn this one. She folded it and placed it in the drawer of the counter, where she kept the receipts for coal, and she did not answer it. She thought, perhaps, that she would answer it one day when she had understood what she wished to say. She was in no hurry. The shop, by the end of that second year, had become a place people came to. It was still Carstairs's Books, because she had not repainted the sign. She had only cleaned it and touched up, in black paint, the letters that had faded past reading. The shelves were ordered now, subject by subject and author by author, in the small clear hand she had learned from Mrs. Gable. The window was clean, the stove was blacked once a month. The brass lamp above the counter was polished every Saturday evening, and the flags of the floor had been washed so many times that they shone in the lamplight like the inside of a river. On an evening in the middle of December, in the 3rd winter she had spent in the shop, she closed the door at 6 o'clock and turned the sign to the side that read Close Ed, and she went behind the counter and lit the brass lamp, and she sat down on the high stool she kept there for the evenings. Ink, who had grown heavier and less patient with the cold, climbed onto the counter and settled himself on the folded linen cloth she kept for him, beside the till. The ledger lay open on the counter. It was Mrs. Gable's ledger. Still, though she had bound in the back of it, over the past year, a further quire of paper to hold the accounts of the shop, and the small leather covers had been rubbed at their corners to a soft pale brown. Beside the ledger lay Mrs. Gable's fountain pen, uncapped, with a small bead of ink at its nib. Beyond the window, in the close, the first snow of the winter had begun to fall. It came down slowly in the still air, in flakes the size of thumbnails, and it settled on the sill and on the sign and on the iron bracket from which the sign hung, and it settled, further off, on the worn steps of the close, so that the close began to look, in the light of the lamp, like a photograph of itself taken a very long time ago. She entered the day's takings in the ledger. She reconciled the column. The column came out even. She wrote at the foot of the page the date. in the small, clear hand Mrs. Gable had taught her, and she capped the pen and set it down beside the book. She sat for a while then, without doing anything, with her hand resting on Ink's back and the warmth of the stove reaching her from behind. She thought of her father, briefly, as she often did at that hour, and she thought of Mrs. Gable, and she thought of old Carstairs, whom she had never met, who had bound into his law books the papers that had, in the end, walked her home. She did not think of Alistair Finch. She had not thought of him for some months. It seemed to her, when she considered it, that she had passed him, somewhere, on a road, and that she did not need to look back to see whether he was still there. The snow went on falling. Somewhere down the Royal Mile a bell rang the half-hour. Ink stirred once under her hand and settled again. The lamp above the counter burned steadily, throwing its small warm circle on the ledger and on the pen and on the flags of the floor, and beyond the circle the shelves rose into a soft brown dimness in which the spines of the books, rank upon rank, gave back the light in small, quiet gleams as of a congregation at evening, standing at ease, waiting to be spoken to in the morning. She closed the ledger. She did not blow out the lamp. She sat on in the lit shop, in the snowlight, for a long time, and she was at last at home. If this story stayed with you, there are more waiting here on the quiet ledger.